The phone rang at the police station in Louisville, Kentucky on September 5th, 2012, and nobody on the other end of that line had any idea they were about to make one of the most significant arrests in recent American history. A 72-year-old man, thin, his face worn down by time and by the streets, was being taken into custody at Wayside Christian, a homeless shelter. The initial reason for the arrest was simple, almost administrative, a warrant for drug possession, nothing that suggested what was coming next. Nobody in that room realized in that moment that they were arresting the most prolific serial killer in American history. The officers thought they had a troubled homeless man on their hands. What they actually had was a predator who had walked free across the United States for more than 4 decades, killing woman after woman, and nobody had ever connected the dots. My name is Christian, and welcome to another episode of this channel. Before we go any further, I need to say something to you directly. It's been over 125 days since our last upload. This channel was demonetized, and for a while, it genuinely felt like this story might not continue. But we're back, and we're back with a better, sharper, more focused style than before. If you've been here since the beginning, thank you for waiting. If you're new, welcome. You're joining at exactly the right moment. Today we're going to explore the disturbing trajectory of Samuel Little, a man who confessed to killing 93 women over more than 35 years, and who was only truly understood after it was already too late for almost all of his victims. Before we begin, if you are new here, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we bring you deep investigations into the criminal mind, always with respect for the victims and rigor in the facts. Now let's go back to that interrogation room in 2012.
The hill, and up top there was vegetation, wasn't no houses or nothing. And so I pulled up in there.
When investigators ran Samuel Little's name through the system, what came up on the screen shocked even the most experienced officers. This wasn't a man with a clean record who had committed one isolated crime. It was a name that kept appearing over and over across different states, across decades. Arrests for theft, arrests for assault, arrests for fraud, arrests for attempted rape, and scattered between those arrests, a disturbing pattern of women who had gone missing or been found dead in the same cities where Little had been. Investigators began to realize they weren't dealing with an ordinary criminal. They used DNA testing to link Little to 3 specific murders that had occurred in Los Angeles in the late 1980s. Linda Alford, killed on July 13th, 1987. Audrey Nelson Everett, killed on August 14th, 1989. Guadalupe Apodaca, killed on September 3rd, 1989. All 3 women were found on the streets of Los Angeles, strangled, their bodies discarded as if they didn't matter to anyone. And that was exactly how Samuel Little saw his victims. But why did it take so long? Why did a man with such an extensive criminal history, with so many documented arrests across 8 different states, manage to kill dozens of women without anyone connecting the pattern? The answer to that question is both simple and deeply disturbing, and we're going to explore it throughout this documentary. But before we do, we need to understand who this man was before he became one of the most prolific killers ever recorded. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7th, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. According to that year's census records, his mother, Bessie May, worked as a maid, and his father was Paul McDowell, a 19-year-old boy. Little would later claim that his teenage mother worked as a prostitute and that she abandoned him as an infant. Soon after his birth, the family moved to Lorain, Ohio, where he was raised mainly by his grandmother. He attended Hawthorne Junior High School, but the records of his childhood paint the portrait of a child with no stability, no consistent maternal figure, raised by relatives doing what they could, but never replacing the fundamental absence that would mark the rest of his life. According to Little's own account, even as a child, he began developing sexual fantasies about strangling women. He said it all started when he saw his kindergarten teacher touch her own neck, an apparently innocent gesture that, in that child's mind, transformed into something else entirely. As he grew older, he began collecting true crime magazines depicting the strangulation of women. These weren't passing fantasies of a curious child. They were the first signs of something that would deepen and crystallize over decades, something he himself, years later, would describe as an inseparable part of who he was. In 1956, Little was convicted of breaking and entering in Omaha, Nebraska, and was held in an institution for juvenile offenders. His booking card carried a note about his mother, whereabouts unknown. Once again, the abandonment. Once again, the absence. In the late 1960s, Little moved to Florida to live with his mother. By his own account, he worked at various times as a cemetery worker and an ambulance attendant, roles that, ironically, kept him constantly close to death and to the human body. He said he began traveling more widely across the United States, and that he had more and more run-ins with the law. Over the years, he was arrested in 8 different states for crimes that included driving under the influence, fraud, shoplifting, solicitation, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and rape. During his time in prison, he took up boxing and later referred to himself as a former prize fighter, as if that were the chapter of his life he preferred people to remember. In 1961, Little was sentenced to 3 years in prison for breaking into a furniture store in Lorain. He was released in 1964, and the pattern kept repeating, arrest after arrest, state after state. By around 1975, he had already been arrested 26 times across 11 different states for crimes ranging from theft to attacks on government officials. 26 arrests, 11 states, and still no connection was being made between this pattern of violent behavior and the women who were beginning to disappear in the cities he passed through. But here's the question that needs to be asked, and that we'll answer in depth throughout this documentary. What was happening inside Samuel Little's mind during all those years? How does a man live through entire decades committing murders, being repeatedly arrested for violent crimes, and still escape any accountability for the greatest crime of all? To understand that, we need to go deep into the psychology of Samuel Little and into the system that, quietly and systematically, allowed him to continue for so long.
She was pretty, a light-skinned, brown, honey-colored skin. She's friendly.
And how much do you think she weighed?
She had a beautiful body, a beautiful 150.
The psychology of Samuel Little is a disturbing case study in how abandonment, distorted fantasy, and a complete absence of empathy can combine over decades into a pattern of predation that is almost invisible to society's eyes. Unlike other serial killers who sought recognition, who left messages, who communicated with police, Little operated in a completely different way. He didn't want to be caught. He didn't want fame. He simply wanted to keep killing, and he had discovered, early in his trajectory, exactly how to do that without being detected. The first fundamental piece of this psychological puzzle lies in how he chose his victims. Little wasn't choosing women randomly, in the sense that any woman could be a target. He was specifically choosing women he believed would leave fewer traces, women whose disappearance would raise fewer alarms, women society had already, in a sense, pushed the margins. Most of his victims were sex workers, substance users, or people experiencing homelessness. He himself stated that he believed these people would leave fewer clues for authorities, and that fewer people would be searching for them. And disturbingly, he was right. The system that should have protected them simply didn't see them as a priority. This is a pattern we've seen before in other cases we've covered on this channel. When society decides, implicitly or explicitly, that certain lives matter less, predators quickly learn to exploit exactly that gap. Samuel Little wasn't a criminal mastermind. He didn't use sophisticated techniques to hide evidence, nor did he have the meticulous planning of other killers we've explored on this channel. What he had was a perverse understanding of how the system worked, and an almost infinite patience to exploit that failure for decades. Little's method also reveals something deeply disturbing about his psychology. He preferred manual strangulation as his method of killing. Unlike firearms or knives, strangulation requires prolonged physical proximity, direct contact, and, according to behavioral experts, gives the attacker a sense of total control over the exact moment of the victim's death. Little was able to watch, up close, the exact moment life left his victims' bodies. That proximity, that control, seemed to be central to the satisfaction he sought in his crimes. Another revealing aspect of Little's psychology was his ability to avoid convictions even when directly confronted by the justice system. In 1982, he was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and faced charges for the murder of Melinda Rose LaPree, a 22-year-old woman who had gone missing that September. A grand jury declined to indict him for her murder. While still under investigation, he was extradited to Florida to stand trial for the murder of Patricia Ann Mount, 26, whose body had been found in September 1982. Prosecution witnesses identified him in court as a man who had spent the night before her disappearance with her. But the jury, distrusting the witness testimonies, acquitted Little in January 1984. Think about that for a moment. He was directly confronted in a courtroom on 2 separate occasions, with evidence linking him to the murders of women, and both times he walked free. Not because he was particularly skilled at hiding evidence, but because the system, again and again, failed to take these women seriously enough to secure a solid conviction. Little then moved to California, settling near San Diego. In October 1984, he was arrested for kidnapping, beating, and strangling 22-year-old Laurie Barros, who survived the attack. 1 month later, he was found by police in the back seat of his car with an unconscious woman, also beaten and strangled, in the same location as the attack on Barros. Little served 2.5 years in prison for both crimes. 2.5 years. For a man who had tried to kill, at minimum, 2 women within weeks of each other. When he was released in February 1987, he immediately moved to Los Angeles and committed, according to investigators, at least 10 more murders. That brings us to a question that echoes across Samuel Little's entire trajectory. How many opportunities did the system have to stop him and how many of those opportunities were wasted? The answer is too disturbing to ignore. Little wasn't invisible. He was constantly being arrested, constantly being investigated, constantly leaving behind a documented trail of violence. The problem was never a lack of evidence that he was dangerous. The problem was that, again and again, the system decided his victims didn't justify the effort required to stop him permanently. We need to pause here to understand the wider context. For decades, women in vulnerable circumstances, especially sex workers, black women, substance users, and women experiencing homelessness, consistently received less investigative attention when they went missing or were found dead. This isn't a phenomenon unique to Samuel Little's case. We've seen similar patterns in other cases explored on this channel, where systemic bias against certain victims allowed predators to operate far longer than they ever should have. Little understood that dynamic, even if he never articulated it that way. He simply knew through repeated experience that certain women could disappear without anyone seriously looking for them. If you're finding this documentary revealing so far, consider leaving a like on the video. It helps the channel keep bringing you deep investigations like this every week. Let's continue. For more than 2 decades, from the late 1980s into the early 2000s, Samuel Little continued his pattern of predation, traveling between states, choosing vulnerable victims, and disappearing before any serious investigation could be carried out. He didn't follow a fixed geographic pattern, which made it enormously difficult for different police departments in different states to connect his crimes. A murder in Ohio, another in Texas, another in Florida, another in Louisiana. Each police department saw only an isolated case, without the broader context that they were dealing with the same man, repeating the same pattern, generation after generation of victims. The absence of a rigid victim profile also made it harder to identify connections. Unlike other serial killers, who generally have a specific type of victim, Little killed women of different ages, ethnicities, and circumstances as long as he believed they fit the profile of someone whose disappearance wouldn't raise sufficient alarm. That apparent randomness was, in effect, an extremely effective strategy, even if not entirely conscious, for avoiding detection. Now we need to talk about something that still echoes today, something that only came to light many years after his initial arrest in 2012. After Little was convicted in September 2014 of the murders of Alford, Everett, and Apodaca, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, many believed that would be the end of the story. He continued insisting on his innocence on the day of the verdict. But what happened next would surprise even the most experienced investigators. In November 2018, nearly 4 years after his initial conviction, Samuel Little began to confess. And he didn't stop confessing. In an interview that would later prove pivotal to understanding his psychology, he said something that still echoes among investigators across the country today.
In our car, we really wanted me to move out of there. So we, instead of going in there, I took her the other way.
Right.
Winding around, they got hills out in Kentucky, and the road winds around the hills. I seen a little short road going up the hill, and up top there was vegetation, wasn't no houses or nothing. And so I pulled up in there and concealed the car in that little vegetation up there on top of the hill.
So tell me about this road that goes up the hill. What kind of road is it?
It was like a dirt road.
Okay.
That coldness, that ability to recite dozens of murders with detailed precision, without any sign of genuine remorse, reveals the depth of the emotional disconnection that defined Samuel Little's entire existence. He wasn't confessing out of guilt. He was confessing, according to investigators, because he wanted a transfer out of the Los Angeles County Jail where he was being held. He was negotiating using his victims' lives as bargaining chips to improve his own conditions of confinement. But there was something deeper happening as well. According to FBI agent Cristina Palazzolo, who worked extensively on the case, Little seemed to have a genuine desire for the world to know the true extent of his crimes. He had lived his entire life without anyone truly understanding who he was or what he had done. And now, at the end of his life, there seemed to be a disturbing need within him for recognition, even if that recognition came through the confession of unimaginable atrocities. Little had one ability that would prove essential to investigators' work: an extraordinarily detailed memory. He could describe, with unsettling precision, the faces of his victims, the places where he met them, the clothes they wore, the bars where he found them, the exact details of how he killed them. And, even more strikingly, he drew portraits of these women, portraits that, decades later, would help identify victims who had remained Jane Does for years, women without names, without notified families, without justice. On November 27, 2018, the FBI announced that a violent criminal apprehension program team had confirmed 34 of Little's confessions and was continuing to work on matching the rest of his confessions to known murders or suspicious deaths. The confessions spread across the country, one state after another, announcing that Little had admitted to crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. On November 9, 2018, he confessed to the fatal strangulation of Melissa Thomas from 1996. On November 13th, he was charged with the murder of Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas, from 1994, after having confessed the crime to a Texas Ranger months earlier. He pleaded guilty to brothers' murder that December, receiving another life sentence. Authorities in Ector County and the Wise County Sheriff's Office, both in Texas, announced that Little had confessed to dozens of murders and may have committed more than 90 across 14 different states between 1970 and 2005. On November 15th, Russell County, Alabama, announced that Little had confessed to the 1979 murder of 23-year-old Brenda Alexander. On November 16th, authorities in Macon, Georgia, announced that he had credibly confessed to strangling an unidentified woman in 1977 and to the 1982 murder of 18-year-old Fredonia Smith. That same fall, he confessed to the murders of 55-year-old Dorothy Richards and 40-year-old Daisy McGuire, both found in Houma, Louisiana. On November 19th, the sheriff of Harrison County, Mississippi, revealed that Little had confessed to strangling 36-year-old Julia Critchfield in the Gulfport area in 1978, dumping her body off a cliff. The following day, authorities in Lee County, also in Mississippi, announced that he had admitted to killing 46-year-old Nancy Carol Stevens in Tupelo. In 2005, the most recent confessed murder of his entire trajectory. On November 21st, authorities in Richland County, South Carolina, announced that he had confessed to murdering 19-year-old Evelyn Weston, whose body was found near Fort Jackson in 1978. He also confessed to killing 20-year-old Rosie Hill in Marianne County, Florida. in 1982. Each of these confessions represented not just a solved crime, but decades of pain for families who never knew what had happened to their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. In December 2018, Little was indicted for strangling 23-year-old Linda Sue Boards to death in May 1981 in Warren County, Kentucky. That same month, one of Little's victims was finally identified as Martha Cunningham of Knox County, Tennessee, killed in 1975 when she was only 34. On May 31st, 2019, prosecutors in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, announced indictments accusing Little of killing Mary Jo Peyton in 1984 and Rose Evans in 1991, both in Cleveland. Both victims were strangled and their bodies discarded. Rose Evans' body, 32 years old, was found on August 24, 1991, in a vacant lot. She had left her hometown of Binghamton, New York, at just 17 in search of a better life. As for Peyton, a forensic anthropologist had to create a model of what she might have looked like, and she remained unidentified until 1992, when her fingerprint finally matched a record in an FBI database. Little had met her at a bar and described her as a short, plump woman in her 20s with brown hair. In June 2019, Little was indicted in Hamilton County, Ohio, for the murders of 2 women in Cincinnati. One of them was identified as Anna Stewart, 33, whose body was found in Grove City. She had last been seen getting out of a cab to visit her sister in the hospital in October 1981. The other woman, killed sometime between 1980 and 1999, remains a Jane Doe, a black woman, slender, who wore glasses, whose identity has never been determined. The portraits Little drew of his victims were released by the FBI in hopes that someone would recognize these women. At least one of those portraits helped solve a cold case in Akron, Ohio. In April 2022, a woman killed in Memphis, Tennessee, whose body had been found on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi River back in 1990, was finally identified as 30-year-old Zena Marie Jones, after her family recognized similarities between Little's sketch and a photograph of her. In total, Samuel Little admitted to 93 different murders, and 60 of those deaths were formally connected to him by police. Most of his victims were sex workers, substance users, or people experiencing homelessness, and most of them were women. He stated that he believed these people would leave fewer clues for authorities and that fewer people would be searching for them. Despite the overwhelming scope of his crimes, Little was formally convicted of only 8 murders, the cases where the evidence was strongest: Annie Lee Stewart, Mary Jo Peyton, Carol Linda Alford, Audrey Nelson Everett, Guadalupe Apodaca, Zena Marie Jones, Rose Evans, and Denise Christie brothers. Now we reach the most important moment of this documentary. It isn't the arrest, it isn't the conviction, it's the moment where we allow ourselves to stop and remember every single woman Samuel Little took from this world. Women who deserve to be remembered for who they were, not just for how their lives were cut short. Let's honor their memories, one by one. Annie Lee Stewart, also known as Anna, was 32 when her life was taken in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1981. Mary Jo Peyton was only 21 and her body remained unidentified for years until technology finally gave her name back to her family. Carol Linda Alford was 41 and was recognized by her own daughter. Audrey Nelson Everett was 35. Guadalupe Apodaca was 46. Zena Marie Jones was only 30, and her family recognized her decades later through a simple sketch. Rose Evans was 32 and had left her hometown in search of a better life at just 17. Denise Christie Brothers was a mother of two, only 32 years old. Mary Jo Brosley was 33, killed in Homestead, Florida in 1970. A woman remembered only as Linda was 22, killed in Miami in 1971. Another, remembered as Marianne, was 18, killed also in Miami around 1971 to 1972. A young woman known only as Donna, between 18 and 25, was killed in Kendall, Florida during that same period. An unidentified white woman between 20 and 25 was killed in Prince George's County, Maryland in 1972. Sarah Brown was 39, killed in New Orleans in 1973. Agatha White Buffalo was 34, killed in Omaha, Nebraska in November 1973. A woman known only as Cat, between 22 and 23, was killed in Savannah, Georgia in 1974. Leola Etta Bryant was 51, killed in Charleston, South Carolina that same year. Martha Cunningham was 34, killed on December 31st, 1974, in Knox County, Tennessee. A woman remembered as Emily, between 23 and 24, was killed in Miami in the mid-1970s. Lee Ann Helms was 21, killed in Houston, Texas in June 1977. Yvonne Pless was 20, killed in Macon, Georgia in September 1977. Clara Birdlong was 44, killed in Pascagoula, Mississippi in December 1977. An unidentified black woman between 17 and 24 was killed in Cleveland, Ohio between 1977 and 1978. Julia Critchfield was 36, killed in Harrison County, Mississippi in January 1978. Evelyn Weston was only 19, killed in Columbia, South Carolina in September 1978. Brenda Alexander was 23, killed in Phoenix City, Alabama in August 1979. Linda Sue Boards was 23, killed in Smiths Grove, Kentucky in May 1981. Patricia Parker, between 25 and 30, was killed in Dade County, Georgia in September 1981. Fredonia Smith was only 18, killed in Macon, Georgia in July 1982. Rosie Hill was 20, killed in Marion County, Florida in August 1982. Patricia Ann Mount was 26, killed in Alachua County, Florida in September 1982. Dorothy Richard was 56, killed in Houma, Louisiana that same September. Melinda LaPree was 22, killed in Pascagoula, Mississippi in October 1982. An unidentified black woman between 30 and 40 was killed in New Orleans that fall. An unidentified black woman between 18 and 23 was killed in San Bernardino, California in 1984. Augie Coates was 23, killed in Savannah, Georgia that same year. A woman remembered only as Granny, around 50 years old, was killed in Los Angeles in 1987. Linda Bennett was 38, killed in Owenton, Kentucky in May 1988. Alice Denise Duval, between 40 and 45, was killed in Los Angeles in June 1991. Roberta Tanderich was 34, killed in Akron, Ohio in September 1991. Alice Denise Taylor, 27, and Tracy Lynn Johnson, 19, were both killed in Gulfport, Mississippi in December 1992. A woman remembered as Ruth, 24 years old, was killed in North Little Rock, Arkansas, sometime between 1992 and 1994, an unidentified black woman, 40 years old, was killed in Las Vegas, Nevada. In 1993, Ruby Dean Lane was 19, killed in Perry, Florida. In May 1993, Jolanda Jones was 26, killed in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. In 1994, Melissa Thomas was 29, killed in Opelousas, Louisiana. In January 1996, Daisy McGuire was 40, killed in Houma, Louisiana. In February 1996, a woman remembered as D-Money, between 23 and 24, was killed in Los Angeles that same year. An unidentified white woman between 23 and 25 was also killed in Los Angeles that year. Priscilla Baxter-Jones was 36, killed in West Memphis, Arkansas in 1997. And finally, Nancy Carol Stevens was 46, killed in Tupelo, Mississippi in August 2005, the last confessed murder of Samuel Little's entire trajectory. Every one of these women had a life. They had childhoods, dreams, people who loved them, even if the world around them didn't always recognize that. Many of them faced poverty, addiction, or had been pushed into the sex trade by circumstances beyond their control. None of them deserved what happened to them. And it is our responsibility as viewers of this story to make sure their names aren't forgotten even decades later. Samuel Little died on December 30th, 2020 in a hospital in Los Angeles County. Although California correctional authorities didn't officially list a cause of death, it's known that he suffered from diabetes, heart problems, and other health conditions. He died without ever standing trial for 85 of the 93 murders he confessed to. He died an old, sick man in a hospital bed, decades after beginning his trajectory of violence, having escaped full justice until the very last day of his life. The legacy of Samuel Little is perhaps one of the most disturbing among all the cases we've explored on this channel, not because of the brutality of his methods, but because of the sheer length of time during which he was able to operate with impunity. He wasn't particularly sophisticated. He didn't leave coded messages. He didn't taunt police with provocative letters. What he had was a perverse understanding acquired over decades of experience that there existed an entire category of women American society simply didn't protect with the same rigor it protected others. Samuel Little's case became, for investigators across the country, a case study in the importance of taking every missing person seriously, regardless of their profession, their history with substances, or their housing situation. After his wave of confessions in 2018 and 2019, police departments nationwide began reviewing cold cases with a new level of scrutiny, recognizing that patterns which once seemed disconnected might, in fact, be the work of the same predator. Journalist Gillian Lauren, who had originally set out to write a mystery novel, began investigating Little and interviewed him extensively in prison, dedicating more than 40 hours to those conversations. During those interviews, he confessed to multiple murders and sent her drawings of his victims. She would later publish a book about her experience, and her investigation would also become the basis for a documentary series that brought even greater public attention to the true extent of Samuel Little's crimes, and, more importantly, to the women whose lives he took. If this documentary helped you understand the psychology behind one of the longest-running cases in American criminal history, leave a like, comment below which case you'd like us to cover next, And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Perhaps the most painful lesson Samuel Little's case leaves us with isn't about the mind of a killer, but about ourselves, about which lives we choose to protect with urgency, and which lives we allow to disappear in silence. Because in the end, the true horror wasn't only what Samuel Little did, it was how long the world took to notice. And this is only the beginning of what's coming. Documentaries are dropping weekly on this channel now, because we have over 7,000 serial killers still left to uncover, still left to understand, still left to remember properly. And I want you on this journey with us for every single one of them. So if that sounds like something you need in your life, don't just watch this and scroll away. Hit subscribe right now, because the next case is already waiting, and you won't want to find out about it late.